slogan, not only is it biblical aspiration, drawn, of course, from Isaiah's vision that they shall beat their swords into plowshares, neither shall they learn war anymore. But it's also this way of naming the constant interaction between the collective and the individual imperative, and between the institutional and the personal. And that's really sort of this dynamic that I kept seeing in the archives. The student Christian movement, and especially the World Student Christian Federation, founded in 1895 as a global ecumenical network linking student Christian movements across continents, and its US affiliates, including the National Student Christian Federation and later the University Christian Movement, mattered because they created those institutions. Conferences like this, committees, publications, international exchanges, and theological frameworks that really gave people a language for justice and a language for world community. But those institutions only really become real when individual people carry that language into their own consciences, their own friendships, their own protests, their own risks. So what I've been doing is spending time in the archives of the WSCF at Yale Divinity School, specifically looking at the Federation's global administrative records, reports, publications, and correspondence, and reading those alongside key secondary sources, especially Sarah Evans's Journeys That Opened Up the World, there on the left, and Michael Thompson's For God and Globe. And what I want to present is a history of formation about how student Christian movements taught people to see the world differently and how they changed what they thought faith required of them in times of war. And I think Sarah Evans gives the clearest statement of the stakes of that. Her book focuses on the period from roughly 1955 to 1975, tracing how women, particularly in student Christian movements, became central actors in civil rights, anti-war activism, and feminist organizing. And she writes that the student Christian movement was a primary site of civil rights and student activism in the 1960s, and that it trained a remarkable generation of leaders who moved directly into the civil rights movement, the student anti-war movement, and women's liberation. And I think that language really matters because trained sort of functions as this operative word. These movements are not just spiritually expressive, they're also pedagogical. And Evans also writes that for many participants, involvement in these movements changed their world and their worldview and took them out of the context in which they were raised. And that displacement, too, geographically, intellectually, theologically, is absolutely central. Anti-war consciousness doesn't emerge just through people gaining more information about war, but because they're relocated through conferences, study abroad programs, ecumenical encounters, of which the Yale Divinity School records really thoroughly cover and capture, into this wider world in which nationalism becomes visible as a problem. So when I turned from Evans to the archives, I found that this process began much earlier than the 1960s. And one of the most important sources I worked with, um, here, I'll go ahead and pull it up here, was a student volunteer movement text titled The Missionary Uprising Among Students, which is an early 20th century document, revised edition circulated in the 1910s, written by Fennel P. Turner, who was general secretary of the movement. And the student volunteer movement itself, founded in the late 19th century, was closely tied to the YMCA and served as a major feeder network for Protestant missionary activity worldwide. And the document recounts the founding moment at the 1886 Mount Hermon Conference in Massachusetts, organized by evangelist Dwight L. Moody, and describes how 250 students gathered and about 100 made a formal pledge, which said, "It is my purpose, if God permits, to become a foreign missionary." And that sentence is extraordinarily important because it frames mission as vocation, mission as obedience, something that's rooted in the individual conscience. But the same text immediately reveals the institutional machinery behind that individual commitment because it states very plainly that the student volunteer movement, quote, has never sent out a missionary and never will. It is simply a recruiting agency. And I think it's an interesting clarification because it shows that rather than the movement itself being the sending body, it is the organizing and training and mobilizing structure that channels students into denominational mission boards. The document goes on to describe a vast infrastructure for that process, including traveling secretaries who visit campuses, conferences that gather students, mission study classes, and networks that link universities across the US and beyond. And it speaks of transforming campuses into strongholds of missionary intelligence, enthusiasm, and activity, and of forming students into real citizens of a worldwide kingdom. So already by the early 20th century, we sort of see this pattern where institutions produce a world and individuals are formed to inhabit it. And that's where Michael Thompson's For God and Globe becomes useful. Thompson's looking at the period between World War I and the Cold War. And he later argues that what we later call Christian internationalism, this critique of nationalism, this commitment to global solidarity, has its roots in earlier figures and networks. And he focuses especially on Sherwood Eddy, a Yale graduate, YMCA leader, and one of the most influential figures in the student volunteer movement and WSCF orbit. And Eddy becomes, in Thompson's telling, a bridge figure, someone who moves from missionary work into a more explicitly political and economic critique of the modern world. And it becomes associated with a circle of Christian socialists and internationalist thinkers centered around a journal called The World Tomorrow, published in New York in the 1920s and 1930s. And through that network, Christianity becomes linked to critiques of capitalism, imperialism, militarism, and it's not yet the Vietnam era anti-war movement, but it really is laying the important groundwork for it. And Thompson also discusses projects like the Mississippi Delta Farm Cooperative, an interracial agricultural cooperative in Mississippi in the 1930s and 1940s, associated with figures like Sherwood Eddy and later civil rights activists. The cooperative attempted to create this alternative economic model rooted in Christian cooperation rather than exploitative sharecropping. And it's a small, concrete example of what happens when Christian internationalists and anti-imperial ideas move from theory into full praxis. I think that's important for the argument because it shows that the student Christian movement has always insisted, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes imperfectly, that belief must be embodied in practice. And when we move back to the archives, we can see both the promise and the contradictions of this movement pretty clearly. And materials from the Madras Christian student movement in India, especially evangelistic bulletins from around 1918, we see a striking use of militarized language. One publication is titled Evangelistic Campaign Bulletin, and it frames the effort in terms of, here, let me pull it up. Here it is, in terms of Christian world victory. And it includes calls for volunteers wanted, echoing the language of military recruitment. And in another section, evangelism is explicitly described through the metaphor of war in a piece titled A Campaign or a War, where strategy, discipline, mobilization are all emphasized. I think that's crucial because it shows that the movement's relationship to war was not initially oppositional. It sort of borrowed the language of war to dramatize commitment. But over time, that same organizational structure, mobilization, discipline, global vision, sort of gets redirected. And we see that redirection become explicit in the 1913 WSCF Executive Committee minutes, which are preserved here at the archives. And these minutes come from a global leadership meeting of the Federation, which at the time linked student movements across Europe, North America, Asia, and Africa. And in those minutes, the Federation is trying to define its purpose. It asks, how can we bring student opinion to bear on Federation policy? And how can the Federation become real to students? Those questions are existential, and they also reveal an awareness that an institution is only meaningful if it's embodied and relevant to its participants. And the minutes also acknowledge that there's some uncertainty as to what the message of the Federation was. So this really wasn't a movement with a fixed ideology, but it was always evolving. And what it articulates in that movement is remarkable. It identifies nationalism as, quote, a serious obstacle, argues that nationalism elevates loyalty to the state above all else, and insists that Christianity demands loyalty to the will of God as supreme. And it even describes, quote, a titanic struggle between nationalism and internationalism. And that's sort of the theological core of anti-war thought in this tradition. The minutes go further, stating that the Federation must, quote, develop a philosophy of life adequate for world peace, make clear the Christian conception of the world community, and also to demonstrate its superiority to nationalism. So by 1931, the institutional articulation is already there. The question then becomes, how does it become lived? And that's where the mid-century materials, especially those that Evans writes about, become so powerful. And this is where I turn to more of the personal papers of various anti-war leaders that are preserved at the archives as well. Um, for example, Charlotte Bunch, I think we have a video of her speaking. For example, she later became a major feminist theorist and activist, and she describes her experience in the Methodist student movement in the YMCA, YWCA networks, and recalls attending a major conference in Athens in 1963, organized through ecumenical student networks, and wrote that through the Y and the MSM at Duke, she had begun to learn about political issues in the United States, but at Athens, she discovered the world. That sentence sort of captures exactly what these movements did. They expanded the horizon of moral concern, fundamentally. She also says that the vision of a politically engaged interracial ecumenical Christian community electrified participants. And very quickly, that vision is translated into political action. The Methodist student movement, she notes, debated the danger of nuclear war and even made an explicit political endorsement in 1964, opposing Barry Goldwater because of his willingness to consider nuclear escalation in Vietnam. And I think now would be a good time to share her video, maybe.
Sure. My name is Charlotte Bunch.
Tell us the story of you with the student position.
Well, I was the child of Methodist family, and I got involved when I first went to Duke University with the Methodist student movement because I was looking for a comfortable, something that felt familiar. I was in Durham, North Carolina, and I had come from a small town in New Mexico. And the Methodist student movement, this was 1962 when I went to Duke, was getting involved in the sit-ins and the whole civil rights movement, Black civil rights movement in the US at the time. And so gradually through the Methodist student movement at Duke, I went to my first pray-in at a segregated church and met with students from the National Negro College and eventually got involved in the Black civil rights movement through that engagement.
Can you tell us the story of the holidays?
Oh, well, after I had gotten involved, I was elected to Yale in the National Council of the Methodist Student Movement. And when it came time for the Selma Montgomery March, the woman who was at the Board of Global Ministries, Peggy Billing was her name, had come from Mississippi, had been a missionary for the Methodist Church, and she was now doing their work in relation to civil rights in the South. She was herself from Mississippi, I think, and she decided that it would be a really good project for the Methodist Student Movement National Council, of which there are about 10 of us, to come to Montgomery and help with the organizing for the Selma Montgomery March. And so we all said, yes, what a wonderful idea, and flew in from our different universities. And we stayed the first night at the Holiday Inn, but we were an integrated group, and the Holiday Inn was still segregated. So there were a couple of Black students in the Methodist Student Movement Council that the Holiday Inn didn't want to have stay there. And so Peggy Billings said, if you don't let them stay here, I'm calling the national headquarters of the Methodist Church in New York and telling them not to have anybody stay in Holiday Inn anywhere in the United States. But that was one of my early lessons in the use of political power by the church. They let us stay, but we decided not to continue to be there. We were there a week before the march, and so they found houses for us in the Black community, and we all moved in twos, I think, into homes in the Black neighborhood. And during the daytime, we would canvass the community to find out how many people were willing to take people who were coming from the march. And we mostly went in teams of one person, Black and one white. And, you know, we couldn't guarantee them whether the people staying would be Black or white or some other race. And we made a list of people in the Black community in Montgomery who were willing to house marchers when they got to Montgomery from Selma. And so it was this group of us who were mostly between the ages of 20 and 25, sort of having this immersion in the civil rights movement and in the practical work of it immediately. So that was one of the memorable things from my national Methodist student movement time, because we didn't march, but we did some of the legwork and met the people and began to understand sort of what the on-site experience is of making a political event like that happen. It was very much a turning point in my life. I was in the process of trying to figure out kind of what I wanted to do with life, as you do when you're a college student. And it was really an important part of that process.
Tell me how your faith motivated you at the time.
Yeah, I think at the time my faith was something that gave me a sense of purpose and a kind of sense of this was the right thing to be done. This was the important work of the moment, and the faith element was that we would be, I can't say safe, but certainly there were people in the civil rights movement who weren't safe, but by and large, a sense that we were doing the right thing and we would be in the right place, and we had faith that it would make a difference to do that, and that it was the right thing to do. So it was also, I think, a way of being in a larger political movement, which the Black civil rights movement in the South of the US was very much immersed in a Black church ethos. So it also was a way of kind of bringing your own faith background to a movement that, more so than many of the secular movements, had a sense of faith-based ideology to it. And so it was really like falling into the arms of an everything Black Southern Christian kind of culture. Even the secular groups like Smith still kind of were immersed in this. So being people of faith in that setting was very powerful, and it gave me a sense that the church can be a very powerful supporter for social change.
All right.
I'm gonna reshare my screen real quick.
Yes.
All right, can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So another person whose papers I looked at was Alice Hageman. And her story shows the same process at the level of personal transformation. She was deeply involved in WSCF networks, including time spent in Geneva working with international ecumenical organizations. And she writes that she came to see herself as an American Christian rather than as a Christian American, and that loving justice was not synonymous with loving my country. And that's a direct challenge to nationalism. It echoes almost exactly the institutional language of the 1931 minutes. Hageman's life then moves through international encounters, relationships with Christians from Eastern Europe, Cuba, and the global South, and into direct anti-war activism during the Vietnam era. And she became involved with the Committee of Returned Volunteers, an organization of former international volunteers who opposed U.S. foreign policy and participated in protests and organizing efforts against the war. And what's striking is that her anti-war stance is not sudden, but more cumulative. It emerges from years of formation, encounter, and reflection. So before I go to the bottom line conclusion of the presentation, I think we have some words to share about Alice.
Oh, no.
No?
You can conclude, Owen, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So if I step back and I try to say what I've worked through, what I've discovered through this work, I sort of want to put it this way. First, the student Christian movement is far more structured and intentional than it might appear. It built systems, educational, organizational, relational, that shaped how people thought and how they acted. And second, those systems were not ideologically static. They evolved and they moved from missionary expansion, often entangled with imperial assumptions, toward a more critical internationalist and eventually anti-war stance. Third, the history of anti-war activism and these movements is not a rupture, but it's really this process of development that grows out of earlier commitments to global Christianity, world community, and the supremacy of divine over national loyalty. And fourth, most importantly, study war no more is only meaningful when we hold together the institutional and the personal. An institution can pass resolutions, publish journals, and organize conferences, but it cannot act. Only people can act. And individuals on their own often lack the language, support, and imagination to sustain that action. So, what the WSCF and really the movements did at their best was to bridge that gap. And they created institutions that formed people deeply enough that those people could carry the movement into the world. So to study war no more is not simply to reject war, but to undergo formation, intellectually and theologically, until one's loyalty shifts, until nationalism is no longer legitimate or ultimate, until justice becomes non-negotiable, until action becomes necessary. And that's the legacy that we're inheriting here today. And that's the work that remains. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Owen.
All right, so I'd love to invite a couple of people we have in the room with us who have some of this historical experience with different iterations of the student Christian movement in the US. I'm just gonna invite them to take a seat up here. I'll invite them to share a couple of short stories in the interest of time. Here, can I? All right, so we have Reverend Luther Felder, who is campus pastor at Payne College, and Ken Guest, who is our board president of the World Student Christian Federation in the U.S. And I would love to invite both of you to share a story about how your involvement in the student Christian movement was impactful as in your formation as a young adult into the adult you became. And if you could also name the group that you were actually involved with, because there were some names that Owen named that Charlotte talked about, and as I said, the student Christian movement has had different iterations, so it's just helpful to have those names. Yes, so Reverend Felder, would you like to start?
I would. I'm grateful for the opportunity. Let me just say that I have to say that at the age of 8 years old, I've only heard my father cry twice in my life. Cry audibly. First time was when his sister died. The second was when he received a phone call. My family received a phone call when I was 8 years old from my brother, who was a student at Clark Atlanta University, Clark College at that time, that he was getting ready to go on the Freedom Ride into Alabama. Mm-hmm. I took that as a call to arms, because my mother took me with her to a grocery store, and I climbed up on the water fountain and drank out of it, and slipped and fell. And the store manager came after me. My mother grabbed me by the hand, took me out of that store. I haven't seen the inside of that store ever again in my life. But the point is that sometimes that formation takes place because of somebody who sees or hears something. I later became a student at Wiley College in Marshall, Texas, and was elected to president of the Methodist Student Movement. Nobody really knew what that was because the chaplain had gone off to get a doctorate, and he was not there, and people were standing here and didn't know what a Methodist Student Movement was. So I knew what a Wesley Foundation was, at least I thought I did, but I didn't know what a Methodist Student Movement was. I went to different conferences looking for what a Methodist Student Movement was, and later that catapulted me into involvement in the Student Christian Movement, which was the Methodist Student Movement, which was the Methodist Student Movement of the 1960s. The period that she's talking about just preceded the time that I talked about. When I came to the Methodist Student Movement, the Methodist Student Movement was about to vote itself out of existence, as was the Presbyterian and the Disciples and the UCC and other denominations were voting themselves out of existence so that we may form one Christian student movement, the University Christian Movement. At the University Christian Movement start, I was fortunate to be elected to its steering committee, and we went to our first steering committee meeting in, I can't remember the year, I think it may have been 1968, 67, 68. We went to the steering committee meeting in Washington, D.C. All of the African American students stayed at Howard University, Wesley Foundation, and we all hung out there. And when we stayed there, and when we went to the student movement meeting, it appeared as though the student movement that existed, the University Christian movement, had become a microcosm, at least it appeared to those of us who were there, that there was no openness. The openness that we had missed in the world was taking place or was not being manifested in this new movement that we all had a hope for. And so the University Christian movement voted itself out of existence. Therefore, there was no Wesley Foundation, there was no Presbyterian campus ministry, there was no Episcopalian. And so it changed the dynamic on the national scale. Somehow there were still persons who helped to make those ministries happen, but there was no student movement. It wasn't until 1988 that the United Methodist Student Movement, the United Methodist, remember us at MSM, Methodist Student Movement, now with the United Methodist Church, and became the United Methodist Student Movement, came into existence. And that organization, I haven't had the opportunity to speak to that group as we were organizing for that, as they were organizing the students for that activity, for that program. And several years later, I became the Assistant General Secretary for Campus Ministry, following in the footsteps of Don Shockley, who was the person who reorganized the United Methodist Student Movement. And I got to work with Sue and several, Sue Rothmar and a number of other persons who were active in the student movements, and that active in the, at least the denominational leaders, in trying to help create student movement. Let me just say this last thing. Student movement, students, I found a new place in my role as a part of the student movement. That new place was to help to create a new generation of Christian student leaders. And many of those young people who were active especially in the steering committee in the United Methodist Student Movement, are now active in delegations to General Conference, the General Conference that voted to split the church, because we insist that the church be open to whoever has gifts that they may serve. They are leaders in delegations to General Conference, leaders in annual conferences, leaders in various other places. And so the work we're doing now, I see raising a new generation of people who will speak truth to power. Amen. And will become that power source. I wore this hat today as a contradiction. It's a contradiction to what we're talking about, because every day I ride around on a golf cart with billionaires. And my aim is to help them to see paying college as a viable option for some of the billions that they spend. Ironically, few do. And so I want to say to you that you have a responsibility. It's going to be a delicate dance, but it's an important dance, because the future of the world depends on, especially with the way that voting rights are being overturned and shattered, voting opportunities are being destroyed, and the effort to reclaim or to claim a unilateral authority in this nation and in the world. It's a part, and it's just like the time of the Crusades. The Crusades have started again, and they are going back to the Middle East, and they are creating havoc in the lands of other peoples. I'm gonna stop.
Thank you, Reverend Felder. Ken.
Thank you, Luther. Also one of my mentors in all of this. My name is Ken Guest. I'm a professor of cultural anthropology at Baruch College, the City University of New York. You know, I've had a pretty a great career as an anthropologist, and I'd just like to say my whole career, both my teaching and my writing, has been shaped by my experiences with the student Christian movements, the World Student Christian Federation. And I'll just say a few words about that. I have a textbook, and the themes through it are about being transformed through field work by getting out of your cultural framework, living someplace else, learning languages, about engaging the global, and an analysis of power. And those things I learned through the student Christian movement and my engagement with the WSCF. So I was a student at Columbia in 1985, and we took over the administration building for 6 weeks to demand the university's divestment in South Africa. And my campus minister, Scott Matheny, also on our board, was there every day for us. And he brought us huge buckets of soup from the soup kitchen, and organized people to come teach us protest songs, and the first time I was ever arrested was marching with students from Columbia and Union Theological Seminary from Columbia down to the South African consulate and blockading the South African consulate. That was spring of 1985. So that was quite a learning experience about how you put your body. Like I was handcuffed and put in the paddy wagon, hauled off, and okay, this is what we do. I studied Chinese. I ended up in Hong Kong, working for the Methodists, and I was invited in 1986 to an international conference in Nanjing, China, to help do translation work, the big international missionary conference. That is just reopening, and the churches in China were trying to rebuild partnerships with churches around the world. And so there were 150 people there from all over the world. And one night, somebody from the WSCF said, anybody who's ever had a WSCF experience, we're going to meet after dinner in this room. And I walked in at least 100 people in that room, from all over the world and from the US. And they went around and told all their stories. And I thought, wow, what happened to me? Like, there wasn't this